The Stono Rebellion was the largest uprising of enslaved Africans during the colonial period. On the morning of September 9, 1739, about 20 slaves in St. Paul's Parish, South Carolina, broke into a small store and confiscated guns, powder, and shots. When the store owners suddenly arrived, the slaves killed them and left their heads on the porch. From here, the slaves, led by Jimmy, made their way to Seminole-controlled Florida, where they knew that free blacks and escaped slaves frequently sought refuge in the southern lands of the Seminole Nation. Subsequent generations of African Americans assimilated into native society but also retained many of their distinct Gullah customs and traditions, which eventually led to the establishment of a unique Black Seminole culture. Tenuous Indian-white relations began to crumble after the Revolutionary War, however, as the nascent U.S. government began exerting political and territorial pressure on many native southeastern groups, sparking the First Seminole War of 1816. On their way they recruited others to join them, and they killed any whites who crossed their path. In the early hours of Sunday, September 9, 1739, 20 enslaved black men gathered near a bridge over the Stono River, southeast of Charlestown, now Charleston, South Carolina, where they were part of a work gang building a public road. Most of them, including their leader, Jimmy aka Cato, appear to have been among the 8,000 Kikongo speakers from the Angola region of Central Africa brought on slave ships over the previous 5 years, mainly to work in the rice fields. By the late 1730s, South Carolina, once the most backward colony in the British Empire, had become a dynamic, expanding and profitable plantation society. It was also the first black majority colony in North America, more closely resembling the Caribbean than New England, the Middle Colonies, or even the smaller-scale slave society of Virginia. By 1739, blacks outnumbered whites 2-1 in South Carolina. In pursuit of their own happiness, the significant profits to be made, a small group of white planters drove their black labor force to endure long hours of backbreaking labor in the rice fields. The arduous work of clearing woods and swamps to build roads was grueling, but, significantly, that morning in 1739 the road gang appears to have been poorly guarded. There was no white overseer present, since slaves were sometimes allowed to work for themselves on Sundays. Perhaps a trusted slave, maybe even Jimmy himself, had been left in charge. At any rate, it is Jimmy who is named in the colony's official report as the Angolan captain of what became known as the Stono Rebellion, the bloodiest slave revolt in colonial North America. No other names are mentioned, and his assigned military rank is noteworthy. The report states that, just before dawn, Jimmy and the other men went from the Stono River Bridge to the nearby Hutchinson's store, where they stole guns and gunpowder and killed and decapitated the 2 white men occupying the building. Their severed heads were left on the steps of the store, perhaps in retaliation for similar beheadings of runaway slaves, or perhaps as part of a traditional African military ritual. James Oglethorpe, as governor of Georgia, was terribly frightened about this incident. He describes the rebellion, as well as the measures he believed would prevent a recurrence of such an uprising so as to not allow the idea of the rebellions and southern safe havens to influence any further incident or escapes to ally with Indians or Spaniards.
Sometime since there was a proclamation published at Augustine, in which the King of Spain, then at peace with Great Britain, promised protection and freedom to all Negro slaves that would resort thither. Certain Negroes belonging to Captain Davis escaped. They were demanded by General Oglethorpe, who sent Lieutenant Demire to Augustine, and the governor assured the general of his sincere friendship, but at the same time showed his orders from the court of Spain, by which he was to receive all runaway Negroes. Being it common for Africans to be literate and multilingual, the Negroes took notice, as it is believed, from the Spanish emissaries. 4 or 5 who were cattle hunters and knew the woods, some of whom belonged to Captain McPherson, ran away with his horses, wounded his son and killed another man. They marched from the direction of Georgia, and were pursued, but the Rangers being then newly reduced, the country people could not overtake them, though they were discovered by the Salzburgers, as they passed by Ebenezer. They reached Augustine, one only being killed and another wounded by the Indians in their flight. They were received there with great honors, one of them had a commission given to him, and a coat faced with velvet. Amongst the Negro slaves there are a people brought from the kingdom of Angola in Africa, many of these speak Portuguese, which language is as near Spanish as Scotch is to English, by reason that the Portuguese have considerable settlement, And the Jesuits have a mission and school in that kingdom, and many thousands of the Negroes there know the Roman Catholic religion. Several Spaniards upon diverse pretenses have for some time past been strolling about Carolina. 2 of them, who will give no account of themselves, have been taken up and committed to jail in Georgia. The good reception of the Negroes at Augustine was spread about. Several attempted to escape to the Spaniards, and were taken. One of them was hanged at Charlestown. In the latter end of July last, Don Pedro, colonel of the Spanish horse, went to Charlestown with a message to General Oglethorpe and the lieutenant governor. On the 9th day of September last, being Sunday, which is the day the planters allow them to work by themselves, some Angola Negroes assembled, to the number of 20, and one who was called Jemmy was their captain. They seized a warehouse belonging to Mr. Hutchinson at a place called Stonehow. They there killed Mr. Robert Bathurst, and Mr. Gibbs, plundered the house and took many small arms and powder which were there for sale. Next they plundered and burnt Mr. Godfrey's house and killed him, his daughter and son. They then turned back and marched southward along Ponds, which is the road through Georgia to Augustine. They passed Mr. Wallace's tavern towards daybreak and said they would not hurt him, for he was a good man and kind to slaves. But they broke open and plundered Mr. Lemmy's house and killed him, his wife and child. They marched on towards Mr. Rose's intending to kill him, but he was saved by a Negro, who having hit him went out and pacified the others. Several Negroes joined them, calling out liberty. They marched on with colors displayed, and 2 drums beating, pursuing all the white people they met with, and killing man, woman, and child when they could come upon them. Colonel Bull, lieutenant governor of South Carolina, who was then riding along the road, discovered them, was chased, and with much difficulty escaped, and brought warning to the countrymen.
In this excerpt from a report sent to the British Board of Trade, Lieutenant Governor William Bull of South Carolina recounted the beginning of the Stono Rebellion and suggested that local Native Americans be given rewards for capturing escaped slaves.
My lords, I beg leave to lay before your lordships an account of our affairs, first in regard to the desertion of our Negroes. On the 9th of September last, I was returning from Granville County with 4 gentlemen and met these rebels at 11 o'clock in the forenoon, and fortunately discerned the approaching danger time enough to avoid it, and to give notice to the militia. It was the opinion of His Majesty's Council with several other gentlemen that one of the most effectual means that could be used at present to prevent such desertion of our Negroes is to encourage some Indians by a suitable reward to pursue and if possible to bring back the deserters, and while the Indians are thus employed they would be in the way ready to intercept others that might attempt to follow, and I have sent for the chiefs of the Chickasaws living at New Windsor and the Catawba Indians for that purpose. My lords, your lordship's most obedient and most humble servant, Governor William Bull. Stono Rebellion Report, 1739.
James Oglethorpe continues his account, stating,
They carried on to burn down Colonel Heck's house and killed his overseer and his wife. They then burnt Mr. Spry's house, then Mr. Sacheverell's, and then Mr. Nash's house, all lying upon the Ponds road, and killed all the white people they found in them. Mr. Bullock got off, but they burnt his house. By this time many of them were drunk with the rum they had taken the houses. They increased every minute by new Negroes coming to them, so that they were above 60, some say 100, on which they halted in a field, and set to dancing, singing and beating drums, to draw more Negroes to them, thinking they were now victorious over the whole province. But when the militia was raised, the planters with great briskness pursued them, and when they came up, dismounting, charged them on foot. The Negroes behaved boldly even after several being killed on the spot. Some ran back to their plantations thinking they had not been missed, but they were taken into the field and shot after being examined. This is to be said to the honor of the Carolina planters, that notwithstanding the provocation they had received from so many murders, they did not torture one Negro, but only put them to an easy death. All that proved to be forced or were not involved in the murders and burnings were pardoned. And this sudden fairness in the field afterwards had so good an effect that there hath been no farther attempt, and the very spirit of revolt seems over. The Negroes fought stoutly for some time, and some escaped the fight and marched southward. In the whole action about 40 Negroes and 20 whites were killed. The rest are yet untaken.
The lieutenant governor sent an account of this to General Oglethorpe, who met the advices on his return from the Indian nation. He immediately ordered a troop of rangers to be ranged, to patrol through Georgia, placed some men in the garrison at Palichocolas, which was before abandoned, and near which the Negroes formerly passed, being the only place where horses can come to swim over, the river Savannah for near 100 miles, ordered out the Indians in pursuit, and a detachment of the garrison at Port Royal to assist the planters on any occasion, and published a proclamation ordering all the constables of Georgia to pursue and seize all Negroes, with a reward for any that should be taken. It is hoped these measures will prevent any Negroes from getting down to the Seminoles or Spaniards. Jimmy then led his men immediately to the house of a man named Godfrey, which they burned down after plundering it for supplies and killing Godfrey, his son and his daughter. Heading south, the rebels reached Wallace's tavern at daybreak but did not kill the innkeeper, apparently because he was kind to the slaves. They did, however, kill Wallace's neighbors and more than 20 other whites and acquired more firearms, gunpowder, provisions and, most important, manpower as they progressed south of the Stono River. By the late afternoon, their number had grown, surpassing 100 when they came to rest in a clearing near the Jacksonboro Ferry on the Edisto River. The colonial authorities at the time believed that Jimmy and his fellow rebels were headed for Spanish-controlled Florida, following the path of hundreds of South Carolina slaves, mostly African-born, who had fled there over the previous 7 years. During that time, the historians say Spanish offered land and freedom to Congo slaves seeking sanctuary in Florida, partly to undermine their British colonial rivals in the region, but also because they accepted the Congolese as fellow Catholics. This narrative seems to be an historical alteration because, like many in Angola since the Portuguese arrival 200 years earlier, had been at war with the Spanish and Portuguese colonizers. In the 15th century, the European, mainly the Spanish and Portuguese, began to flock to Africa as if in a gold rush. And indeed, the Spanish and Portuguese found treat, an African population that had fortunes and they could capture and sell into slavery. And so colonies of Spaniards and Portuguese emerged along the western coast of Africa, colonies that became the foundation for taking over countries and slave trade transit stations. Historical events such as when the Great Queen Nzinga of Angola continued the battles against the Europeans and repelled them all, as her father and brother did, whom she inherited the kingdom from. When her father passed away and her brother took the reins, Nzinga received an important mission, to lead her kingdom's diplomatic mission, called Nanga and Matamba, to reach a peace settlement agreement with the Portuguese. She agreed to treaties with the colonizers only for them to attack her kingdom again. On one such occasion, João Correa de Souza, the head of the Portuguese delegation, wanted to humiliate the African delegation. When Nzinga arrived at the meeting place, she found the entire Portuguese delegation sitting down, but not one single seat reserved for her or anyone else in the African delegation. Without thinking twice, one of her maids bent down and served as a human chair for Nzinga throughout the meeting. The Africans were very familiar with the wickedness of the Spanish and Portuguese, so it does not seem likely that they would head south to Florida on promises by the Spanish, but most likely to the Native American and African settlements that were there. Historians now believe that his ability as a military leader and his fellow rebels' knowledge of pistols and muskets had probably been acquired during the military conflicts that raged in the Congo in the 1720s and 1730s, and during which he was most likely enslaved. Slaves who recently arrived from Africa, in particular, were drawn to the advance of Jimmy's forces by the sound of their drums and the sight of their banners, which resembled those used in Angolan warfare. Even those who were not African-born were roused by the rebels who cried out, "Lukongo, Lukongo, Lukongo, liberty," in the Kikongo language. Others were emboldened by the apparent ease with which their masters were overcome and by the military expertise of Jimmy's soldiers and their growing arsenal. Those who joined the rebellion may also have heard the news, reported in Charleston just 2 days earlier, that Britain and Spain were now at war. If the communication network of the slaves worked as rapidly and efficiently as it often did, perhaps they were persuaded that a heightened British military presence in South Carolina and Georgia would make it much harder to escape to Florida in the coming months. They might also have known of several recent rebellions in the Caribbean, notably in St. John, 1733, Antigua, 1736, and especially Jamaica, where the British were forced in 1738 to sign a peace treaty with the rebellious African-descended Maroons led by Queen Nanny and Cudjoe.